Under a sky faded by the first light of dawn, Sarah Pierce stood on her back patio with a mug of black coffee pressed between both hands. Her eyes, sharp and focused, moved slowly over the still water of the newly completed pool. The surface was undisturbed, dark like slate, the deep end tapering into a submerged bench she'd insisted on installing herself. Not for aesthetics, but for therapy. Her physical therapist had recommended aquatic exercise to aid with the spinal damage she'd sustained 2 years ago in a head-on collision during a routine weekend drive. Most people might have opted for a heated spa or a contractor-installed swim jet. Not Sarah. She researched filtration systems, slope tolerances, tile friction coefficients. Every inch of that pool had been calculated, tested, double-checked. It wasn't vanity or indulgence. It was engineering, it was therapy, and it was hers. The new house sat at the tail end of a cul-de-sac in a development that was neither upscale nor neglected, somewhere in that suburban purgatory where most residents paid their dues, watered their lawns, and preferred not to make eye contact with each other unless necessary. It suited her. She wasn't a recluse, but she wasn't built for casual neighborhood wine nights or endless committee emails. After 2 decades consulting for federal contractors on hydrodynamic modeling and liability mitigation in recreational infrastructure, she'd learned to value silence, precision, and personal space. Sarah had moved in 6 months ago after signing what she thought was a routine property transfer. She didn't care for the political squabbles that often simmered under the surface in these communities. She knew how these little councils worked: half-hearted votes, ill-informed directives, people acting as petty tyrants because someone gave them a clipboard and a badge with the word "board" on it. But she also knew how to navigate them. Her fence had the correct setback, her permits were in order, and her contractors were licensed, bonded, and certified in triplicate. She didn't give anyone a reason to question her presence, at least not until the pool was finished. The construction itself hadn't drawn much attention. The crew was quiet, punctual, and kept to the schedule. But the moment the final tile was sealed and the water treatment started cycling through the ozone and UV filtration system, Sarah noticed a shift in the air, the kind of shift you feel when you step into a room where someone has just been arguing, and the silence is heavier than sound. It started with looks, nothing hostile, just curious stares from windows or slow-moving dog walkers. Then came the conversations. "That's a bit large for a single occupant, isn't it?" a passing jogger had asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're going to need a cover," another had added. "Wouldn't want kids falling in by accident." Sarah had learned long ago the value of ignoring what didn't require a response. People felt threatened by autonomy, especially when it came from someone who didn't ask for permission to be competent. She let the comments roll off her back, until Karen showed up. It was a Sunday, just before noon. The kind of day when the sun sits at that perfect angle, warming the shoulders but not the scalp. Sarah was on the bench ledge, letting her legs soak while a podcast played through a waterproof speaker perched by the edge. The gate leading to the side yard had been locked, or so she thought. A sound, soft, deliberate, made her turn. She saw her. Karen, stepping around the corner of the house, her white cardigan hanging limply off one shoulder, flats wet from dew, eyes scanning the space like she was taking inventory. Sarah stood. "You're on private property." Karen smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she didn't believe property lines applied to her. "I just wanted to say hello. I've been meaning to introduce myself." "You could have done that at the mailbox. Or not at all." Karen took a step closer to the pool, then another. "I have to admit, this is really something. You must have spent a fortune." "I spent time, and planning, and permits." Karen crouched briefly, her fingers skimming the edge of the coping tile. My granddaughter would love this. She's here for the summer. Poor thing gets so bored. Would be nice if we could come over once in a while. Just an hour or two." Sarah's tone didn't shift. "That won't be possible." Karen blinked, her smile faltering for half a breath. "It's just neighborly, you know? Sharing. We're all part of the same community." "I'm not running a community center. I'm recovering from a spinal injury. This isn't recreational, it's medical." Karen's expression changed almost imperceptibly. There was something cooler now behind her eyes, something weighing and calculating. "Oh, I see. Well, I hope it's not too deep. Those can be dangerous, especially if someone slips." Sarah didn't respond. She picked up her towel, dried her legs, and walked inside without another word. She waited until the sound of Karen's footsteps faded before she went out the front door to relock the gate, this time using a reinforced chain. That night, Sarah reviewed her security footage. The cameras weren't intrusive, just enough to capture movement along the fence line and the side yard. Karen had unlatched the gate from the inside using a rake handle through the bars. Deliberate, not accidental. The footage was saved to the cloud, not because she anticipated trouble, but because the world had taught her to prepare for it. For a few days, there was nothing. No visitors, no comments, not even lingering glances. Then came the call, a soft chime from the doorbell camera, followed by the voice of a man identifying himself as Michael Leary, a representative from the residential council. Sarah opened the door partially. He held a clipboard, didn't make eye contact. "We received a complaint regarding the safety features of your pool." "From whom?" "I'm not authorized to say, but the concern relates to the depth and absence of a perimeter fence within the pool boundary. Standard protocol is a dual barrier, especially in homes adjacent to family-occupied properties. Your barrier requirement applies to community access pools. This is private. Code 9.2.13b, residential exemption with self-locking perimeter fencing." "I have the signed inspection forms from the final build-out." Michael hesitated. She could see he hadn't expected a legal citation. "Well, we'll still need to file a notice and potentially arrange a review. Nothing formal, just procedure." "You don't get to invent procedures to appease paranoia. Send me the complaint in writing. I'll respond through counsel." The man left without argument, but the seed was planted. The next morning, Sarah found an envelope taped to her garage. No stamp, no postmark. Inside was a printed letter, unsigned, stating that a potential drowning event had occurred on her property, and that until an inquiry was completed, the use of the pool was to be voluntarily suspended. The language was vague but threatening, like a warning growled through a closed door. She checked the footage again. Karen hadn't returned, visibly, but the system had picked up a body heat signature near the western hedgerow at 2:42 a.m., 3 nights prior. Nothing entered the pool. Nothing exited. Just movement. Watching. Sarah didn't panic. Panic was for people without contingency plans. She called her contractor to verify the code compliance. She called her attorney to initiate a formal rebuttal to any false incident report. And she wrote down a name, Karen, and a date. She wasn't building a case, not yet, but she was keeping a record. Because people like Karen didn't knock once. They found a crack, and they started digging. And Sarah Pierce didn't let anyone dig into her life. Not without finding out who they were really trying to bury. Under the heavy shade of early summer clouds, Sarah received an official-looking envelope in the mail. Not from a name she recognized, but bearing the embossed crest of the neighborhood's residential committee. Unlike the unsigned letter taped to her garage, this one had a return address, a barcode, and the flat, impersonal tone of a bureaucratic notice written by someone who believed rules were best followed without question. The letterhead identified it as a Community Safety Advisory Notice, and it opened by acknowledging the committee's commitment to maintaining a secure and harmonious environment for all residents. The next paragraph, however, shifted tone, stating that a recent incident involving a near drowning had raised concerns regarding aquatic hazards presented by private recreational structures within the community. It specified her address. It cited her pool. It referenced multiple reports without naming names and informed her that a temporary usage moratorium was being recommended pending voluntary compliance with hazard review protocol. Sarah folded the letter slowly, placed it on the kitchen counter, and poured herself a glass of water, the kind of controlled response born of professional detachment. She'd been through depositions, cross-examinations, and post-incident reviews involving multi-million-dollar infrastructure failures. She knew the language of obfuscation and passive coercion, and she recognized the strategy at play. They weren't accusing her of wrongdoing outright. They were nudging her into compliance by invoking fear, liability, and isolation. She called her attorney immediately. Mitchell Rowan had been her go-to for liability work since before her accident. A former city planner turned legal analyst, he had a sharp eye for overreach disguised as concern. After reading the letter, he responded with the same dry professionalism she valued. They're testing boundaries. There's no legal weight to this unless they escalate through code enforcement or claim injury. For now, you're under no obligation to change anything. Still, Mitchell recommended documenting everything, and Sarah already had. The footage from her security system, date-stamped, backed up remotely, clearly showed Karen trespassing. There had been no fall, no submersion, no loss of consciousness. She'd sat herself down on the coping tile, dipped her feet in, and made enough of a scene to be seen. Later, after the paramedics had checked her vitals and deemed her stable, she'd refused transport to the hospital, citing nerves and overexertion. But someone, likely Karen herself, had turned that event into a reportable incident, likely through a non-emergency call to the city's health and safety hotline. It didn't take much, just the right words spoken to the right ear, and suddenly a benign event became a community hazard. By Wednesday, the committee had sent another notice. This time, they included a checklist: fencing adjustments, underwater lighting review, depth signage, none of which were required for private residential pools under the current municipal code. But the checklist was labeled as strongly encouraged compliance standards for urban aquatic zones, a phrase Sarah had never encountered before in any professional document. She ran a search. Nothing. No legal precedent. No city mandate. Just invented terminology, vague enough to sound official and aggressive enough to intimidate someone unfamiliar with the law. She sent the letter to Mitchell, who replied an hour later with a curt message. "This isn't code. It's a bluff. Do not respond directly. I'll draft a statement demanding withdrawal of the advisory under threat of legal action for harassment." She trusted him, but trust didn't equate to peace. These weren't just random letters. They were the beginning of a campaign, and Sarah knew from experience that the worst campaigns didn't start with fire, they started with smoke. Subtle pressure, isolation, soft threats made to sound like friendly advice, the kind of pressure that made people give up not because they had to, but because it was easier than fighting. The next day, her pool maintenance contractor called and left a cryptic voicemail. He'd been servicing the ozone filter since installation and had never missed a visit. Now he was suddenly unavailable for a while. No explanation, just that the company was changing routes, and her area didn't make sense logistically anymore. Sarah had reviewed the contract. Technically, it was a month-to-month service. They were under no obligation to continue, but she could hear the hesitation in his voice. He wasn't saying what he wanted to say. 2 days later, the landscaping crew she used emailed to say they were no longer servicing properties with active hazard claims. It wasn't a legal designation, but it was enough to justify pulling back. It was like a slow, invisible wall rising around her property, cutting her off service by service, resource by resource. No one told her directly that Karen was behind it, but Sarah didn't need confirmation. She recognized the strategy because she had used it herself, professionally, ethically, and under legal guidance, to isolate hazardous installations until issues could be addressed. But this wasn't a spillway collapse or a failed drainage slope. This was one woman's vendetta, filtered through the prism of suburban pettiness. On Friday morning, she walked outside to find an orange sticker adhered to her mailbox. Thin, square, unbranded. It didn't say violation or citation. It simply read, "Under review." Below that, in smaller print, "Contact the Residential Committee for information regarding current assessments." Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. But she stood there for several long minutes, staring at the sticker, aware of what it meant even if it meant nothing legally. It was a flag, not for her, but for everyone else who passed by. A quiet suggestion that something about this house wasn't safe. Not proven, not charged, just suspected. Later that afternoon, she received a voicemail from a woman identifying herself as Karen's daughter. The tone was falsely polite, the kind of sugary condescension Sarah found more infuriating than anger. The woman said she'd heard about the situation and wanted to extend an olive branch. Perhaps there was a way to adjust the pool's usage parameters to prevent further issues. Perhaps an agreement could be reached about access, about times, about quiet hours. Sarah didn't call back. She forwarded the voicemail to Mitchell and added it to the growing dossier. That night, she reviewed her camera footage again, starting from the day Karen had first entered uninvited. She logged timestamps, movement markers, and contact attempts. The system had a heat signature detection function, and over the last 10 days, it had picked up 5 different nighttime movements near the fence line, each less than 2 minutes, always between 2 and 4 a.m. No entry, no incident. Just presence. Then came the final push. A certified letter delivered Monday morning. Official paper. Embossed seal. Inside, the committee had issued a formal complaint citing reckless endangerment via negligent aquatic design, referencing city code that didn't apply to private homes. It demanded immediate suspension of pool usage pending a review and included a veiled threat about liability implications should further incidents occur. Sarah knew this was the moment. They were moving from suggestions to demands, from pressure to action. And behind it all, Karen, the neighbor who had walked onto her property without permission, who had dipped her toes into someone else's life and then claimed to be drowning. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the open letter. She didn't feel anger. Not yet. What she felt was something older, deeper, the same calm certainty she'd felt when she stood on a witness stand 3 years ago, testifying about a failed spillway design that had nearly flooded a town. She hadn't caused the failure, but she'd known how to explain it. And now, someone was trying to frame her as a risk, not a person, not a neighbor, but a hazard, a label, a problem to be managed. She reached for her phone, dialed Mitchell, and said only 4 words. "It's time we respond." The letter sat unopened on the kitchen counter for most of the day. Sarah had seen the return address, Municipal Oversight Liaison, Department of Residential Integrity, and already knew it would be filled with regulatory language twisted into something almost, but not quite, enforceable. She didn't need to read it to understand what it would say. The signs had been building for weeks. Service providers withdrawing, contractors avoiding her calls, neighbors lowering their eyes at the mailbox. She wasn't being accused outright, but she was being surrounded. It was a slow siege, carefully orchestrated, not by the department itself, but by someone feeding it just enough concern and ambiguity to trigger protocol. Someone with enough persistence to stay below the radar of law, but above the threshold of influence. Sarah opened the envelope not because she expected anything new, but because she believed in knowing the shape of the weapon being used against her. The letter cited a newly initiated safety review audit under subsection 12B of the Residential Stability Framework, another invented designation. There was no such enforceable framework listed in city code. The audit, they claimed, was routine and preemptive, triggered by unspecified resident reports involving repeat incidents, concern of passive environmental threat, and visually unverifiable depth. It was bureaucratic nonsense meant to sound intimidating while remaining legally hollow. But that didn't make it harmless. These were the tools of institutional pressure. No direct commands, no outright violations, just constant insinuation, implication, erosion of stability through the soft power of relentless inquiry. She passed the letter to Mitchell later that evening during a meeting at his office. He read it once, expression unreadable, then again more slowly. His fingers tapped the desk in a metronomic rhythm, eyes narrowing at the wording. "They're not just playing games now," he said. "This language suggests they're preparing to involve city inspectors. If they can't trap you through code, they'll try environmental standards. Water quality, drainage slope, runoff displacement, anything that lets them step onto your property without your consent." Sarah asked what her options were. Mitchell leaned back, fingers laced together, voice level. "You can file for an injunction against coordinated harassment, but that won't stop the audit if the city signs off. What you need is an external evaluation, independent, credentialed, and untouchable. Someone with more weight than their inspector, and we need it now, before they send someone with a clipboard and a bias." Sarah didn't ask how much it would cost. She gave Mitchell approval and asked him to arrange it. By the time she returned home that night, the pool lights were off. Not because of malfunction, because she'd disabled them. Until this was over, she would treat the water as evidence. No swimming, no guests, just observation. If they were going to turn her property into a battleground, she would meet them with the discipline of a forensic technician, not the emotion of a victim. The following morning, Sarah noticed the first visible sign of escalation. A stake in her front lawn with a plastic tag reading, "Pending Review Zone." It wasn't official. No seal, no city branding, just plastic text printed on an office label. But it was placed there deliberately, staked at an angle so passers-by could see it. Psychological warfare through symbols. It didn't accuse, it suggested. Sarah photographed it, pulled it out, and documented the location with GPS stamps. When she checked her cameras, she saw someone unfamiliar placing it there at 4:27 a.m. Hoodie, gloves, surgical mask. The footage was clear enough to track posture, gait, motion, but not identity. She sent the footage to Mitchell. He didn't say much, just that it would be added to the case log and forwarded to their private evaluator. 2 days later, an unmarked utility vehicle parked across from her house. It had no license plates, just magnetic stickers reading "Residential Services." No uniformed personnel stepped out, only 2 men in jeans and safety vests, both with tablets. They didn't approach the front door. They walked slowly along the sidewalk, stopping to point at the side yard, at the drainage path, at the hedgerow. One of them leaned forward and placed a yellow chalk mark on the curb. Sarah didn't confront them. Instead, she activated the secondary camera grid Mitchell had installed, a hidden set of motion-triggered units with longer range and higher resolution. The men didn't linger, but one of them pulled something from his vest and slipped it into her mailbox. After they left, Sarah checked. It was another flyer, this one hand-folded and laminated. Community Water Risk Awareness, with a number that redirected to an answering service. Mitchell called it a soft warning, designed to make her feel watched, to confuse her sense of control. That afternoon, her insurance company contacted her to confirm a notice received from a concerned party, indicating active investigation into non-compliant aquatic structures. The representative sounded apologetic but firm, until the issue was resolved. Her liability umbrella would be downgraded to baseline residential. If someone were to enter her pool now, with or without permission, and experience injury, she would not be covered. It wasn't cancellation, but it was a loaded gun set gently on the table. That night, Sarah received her first direct message from Karen since the incident. A plain envelope slid under her door, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on floral stationery. The tone was light, the message short. I hope things settle soon. If you ever want to discuss compromise, you know where I am. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Sarah read it 3 times, then placed it in the folder with the rest of the evidence. There was nothing overt, nothing threatening, just the smug confidence of someone who knew the pressure was working. But Karen had made one mistake. In assuming Sarah would be intimidated by isolation, she'd forgotten who she was dealing with. Sarah didn't fear silence. She thrived in it. The independent evaluator arrived 2 days later. A certified aquatic risk engineer from a private consultancy Sarah had worked with years ago on municipal retrofits. His assessment was clinical, thorough, and unflinching. He found no fault. Every slope, edge, filtration flow, and entry point met or exceeded regulatory standards. His report included high-resolution images, thermal scans, and a full water quality analysis. He filed it directly with Mitchell and CC'd the Department of Residential Oversight, attaching his credentials, certification authority, and municipal clearance status. Within 48 hours, the audit was stalled. Not canceled, but postponed indefinitely pending clarification of prior complaint. Sarah knew what that meant. The city didn't want to touch a case where the evidence was too clean. There was no liability to chase, no public hazard to contain. But that didn't mean the pressure stopped. 3 days later, a neighbor, someone she barely knew, stopped her during a walk and asked in a strained tone if the rumors were true. He mentioned something about bacteria levels, about runoff leaching into the soil. Sarah didn't dignify it with a full explanation. She simply said the pool had passed state-level inspection and left him blinking. But the moment she turned the corner, she saw Karen standing on her porch, arms folded, watching. She wasn't smiling, not yet. But Sarah recognized the look. It was the stare of someone trying to gauge distance between victory and resistance. When Sarah returned home, she found a flyer on her windshield. This one wasn't from a city office or a committee. It was from a neighborhood safety coalition, an unofficial group that had never existed until this week. The flyer listed guidelines for community aquatic awareness, none of which were legally binding, all of which implied a growing fear of unregulated installations. It was unsigned, but included a QR code linking to a page filled with generic warnings, copied and pasted from unrelated safety manuals. Karen wasn't operating alone anymore. She was recruiting, and the siege was no longer soft. It was formal, collective, and moving toward escalation. Sarah didn't call Mitchell that night. She didn't need to. Instead, she sat at her desk, opened a fresh folder, and titled it Active Campaign. The time for passive documentation was over. If they wanted to push, she would push back, not through shouting or confrontation, but through process, through evidence, through the same cold precision that had made her an expert witness in high-stakes litigation. This wasn't a war of passion. It was a case, a structural pressure test, and Sarah Pierce knew exactly how to handle structural stress. The letter from the city arrived without ceremony. No bold headlines, no urgent stamps, just a plain envelope with a printed address and the calm, bureaucratic tone of officialdom. Sarah opened it while standing at her kitchen island, already expecting another indirect accusation. But this one struck a new chord. It was a notice of review scheduling, a formal on-site assessment to be conducted by a municipal environmental safety liaison in coordination with the residential committee. The phrasing was deliberate. Unlike the previous vague threats and advisory notices, this letter included an actual date and time. They were coming, not to speculate, not to suggest, but to inspect. It wasn't a surprise, not entirely, but it shifted the tone of everything. Sarah had spent the past several weeks responding to anonymous pressure, hidden actors, whispered rumors. Now there was a face, an official one, and a countdown. Mitchell reviewed the letter and responded quickly. They're not just escalating, they're formalizing. This gives them the cover to enter the property under the guise of municipal authority. We can't stop them, but we can control the context. He arranged for Sarah's independent evaluator to be present during the inspection, which immediately forced the city to agree to transparency protocols. Sarah spent the next 2 days preparing. Not just the physical space, which she'd maintained immaculately from the start, but her documents. Certifications, permits, design specs, post-construction reports, photos of every phase of installation. Her dossier was precise, indexed, and cross-referenced. Not because she feared failure, but because she knew the burden of proof always fell on the one being challenged, not the one making the accusation. On the day of the inspection, the sky hung low with humidity, and the air felt swollen with static. The liaison arrived on time, accompanied by a local code representative, a young man with nervous eyes and a clipboard he never looked up from. Behind them came 2 members of the residential committee, including the man Sarah recognized from the original notice, Michael Leary, and a woman she'd never seen before but who moved with the slow entitlement of someone used to her suggestions being treated as law. Sarah stood beside her evaluator, who greeted the inspectors with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen too many of these processes dissolve into personality contests. They began at the front of the property, working their way around the side and into the backyard. The pool, as expected, passed every standard. The fencing was compliant, the slopes within tolerance, the lighting approved, and the signage appropriate. Even the water quality, which Sarah had proactively tested again that morning, exceeded all residential health requirements. The liaison asked questions with mild curiosity but no real suspicion. It was clear he was performing a task, not pursuing an agenda. But the committee members remained stiff, occasionally whispering to each other and gesturing with subtle disapproval. At the depth markers, at the lack of a pool cover, at the silent, locked gate that no one had ever entered without permission. Finally, the woman Sarah didn't recognize spoke directly, her tone almost theatrical. "It's very unusual to have this kind of installation in a neighborhood like ours. So close to families, small children. Visibility is a concern. We've had complaints about the shadows cast by your pool lights at night." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She waited, then responded with measured calm. The lighting system is motion-activated, designed to minimize ambient intrusion. Its position and brightness are within local code parameters, which were approved prior to installation. If there's a specific complaint, I suggest it be filed through official channels." The woman frowned, clearly unsatisfied, but said nothing more. Mitchell's evaluator handed the liaison a printed summary of findings. It was short and absolute. No violations, no concerns, no corrective actions recommended. The liaison nodded, shook Sarah's hand, and left. The committee members lingered a moment longer, then departed without comment. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. It was never going to be as simple as passing a test. This wasn't about the pool. It never had been. It was about presence, ownership, control. That evening, as the sky darkened into a heavy dusk, Sarah sat on her patio and watched the glow of the underwater lights through the now silent water. They pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. She didn't swim. She didn't even dip a toe. Instead, she reviewed her security footage again. No trespassers, no movement. But the pattern had changed. Where once the pressure had come in waves, letters, notices, service withdrawals, it had now gone quiet. That kind of silence was never innocent. It meant strategy, repositioning, a different kind of play. At midnight, an email appeared in her inbox. No sender name, just an address she didn't recognize. It contained no message, only a single attachment. A scanned page from what looked like an internal memo. The document bore the header of the residential committee and referenced ongoing conflict regarding installation at her address, suggesting potential transition to legal leverage pending community consent. Below that, a brief paragraph mentioned a name, Karen Mercer, listed as incident witness and ongoing complainant. It wasn't confirmation. It wasn't even admissible as evidence. But it was the missing link, proof that Karen wasn't just the spark. She was the engine. Sarah didn't respond to the email. Instead, she printed it, logged its metadata, and added it to the active campaign folder. She then called Mitchell and left a voicemail. "We need to talk about acceleration." The next morning, she met him in his office where he reviewed the document and immediately launched a discovery request. If the committee had begun internal discussions about litigation or reclassification, they would be required to disclose it if formal proceedings were initiated. Mitchell wasn't planning to wait. He drafted a cease and desist letter addressed to the committee as a whole, citing coordinated harassment, reputational defamation, and administrative targeting. The letter was delivered by courier and signed for by a junior representative. Within 2 hours, Sarah received an email reply stating the committee was reviewing its internal procedures and would pause all further assessments pending administrative clarity. That afternoon, Sarah finally spoke to her neighbor from 2 doors down, an older woman named Gwen who'd always been polite but reserved. Gwen knocked on her door holding a small potted plant. No explanation, just a peace offering. They sat for 20 minutes on the patio while Gwen spoke carefully about the atmosphere in the neighborhood, about how some of us don't agree with what's happening. She didn't name Karen, she didn't mention the committee, but she left behind more than just the plant. She left behind a signal that the wall around Sarah wasn't as solid as it seemed. Later that evening, Sarah received one final call. This time, it was Karen herself. The number wasn't blocked. The voice was calm. Karen didn't apologize. She didn't threaten. She simply said, "I just hope you know that not everyone around here is comfortable with what you've built. Sometimes things don't belong, even if they're allowed. And sometimes the rules don't keep people safe." Sarah didn't hang up. She listened, then said, "The difference between what's allowed and what's feared isn't my responsibility. It's yours." She ended the call without waiting for a response. For the first time in weeks, she slept with her phone turned off. Under a heavy and humid sky that pressed like a weight against the rooftops of the neighborhood, the illusion of de-escalation began to crack. For a few days following the inspection, Sarah allowed herself a fraction of relief. Not comfort, not rest, just the brief, almost mechanical recognition that for the moment the offensive had stalled. The inspector's report had been clean, the committee temporarily silenced by Mitchell's cease and desist, and the air had lost some of its static charge. But she knew the feeling well. It was the pause before a second storm, not the end of the first. Sarah maintained her routine with mechanical precision. She reviewed footage, updated logs, stayed in communication with Mitchell, and doubled her backups. She also upgraded the secondary sensor grid to include vibration detectors on the fence line. Not because she expected sabotage, but because she had stopped underestimating the pettiness of people who felt entitled to someone else's compliance. It was in this exact window of apparent quiet that the real shift occurred. 3 days after the inspection, her bank flagged a transaction. Not a fraudulent charge, something subtler. A mortgage verification inquiry had been submitted to the bank's lending division. It wasn't a refinancing request, it was an internal flag, something typically used in preparation for lien negotiation or third-party acquisition interest. Sarah had not initiated any such process. She called the bank immediately. The representative confirmed that the request came from a title service that occasionally worked with the committee's real estate advisor on zoning purchases and redevelopment initiatives. Sarah felt her stomach turn, not with fear but with a deep, angry recognition. This wasn't about safety. It never had been. It was about displacement. She was the holdout in a zone targeted for transformation, one large enough for small developers to care, but small enough for the city to look away while soft pressure did the work of legal force. Mitchell confirmed her suspicion after a series of quiet calls. A private development firm had recently begun courting the committee with offers to beautify and restructure the neighborhood's western quadrant, the same area where Sarah lived. The plan was early stage, unofficial, and entirely off the books. But the objective was clear: reduce resistance, apply incremental pressure, and make homeowners want to leave without anyone having to forcibly remove them. Sarah's presence, and more specifically her pool, was a complication. It represented permanence, investment, and resistance, and now the committee was looking for financial leverage. The next step came 2 days later, when Sarah's homeowner's insurance was formally suspended pending resolution of regulatory disputes. It was a calculated move. The insurer had received repeated notifications, unverified but numerous, claiming that the property posed active hazard exposure. When Sarah demanded documentation, they offered only that the volume of complaints triggered a risk threshold that obligated them to pause coverage. No investigation had taken place. No violations had been proven, but in their world, risk was risk, and risk meant money. Sarah understood the game. This wasn't about winning in court. It was about grinding down a person's ability to stand still. You couldn't defend a home you couldn't afford to insure. Without insurance, she had to suspend pool use entirely. It wasn't optional anymore. If someone, anyone, were to step foot onto her property and suffer so much as a sprain, she'd be exposed. Sarah locked the gates, turned off the filtration system, and placed signage that read, "Closed for private maintenance." She also filed an immediate appeal with the State Insurance Commission, attaching the inspector's report, the evaluators, findings, and copies of every letter she'd received. Mitchell pushed the appeal aggressively, demanding a hearing and full audit of complaint origins. It was a strong move, but it wouldn't be swift. Bureaucracy was slow, and attrition was fast. That was the calculus the committee counted on. Meanwhile, Sarah began receiving emails from an anonymous address. This time, not veiled threats, but offers. "There are easier ways out of this," read one. "People around here can be very understanding when given the right reasons." Another read, "You don't have to keep fighting. There's interest in your lot. Just talk to the committee. It could be a smooth transition." The messages were phrased with careful ambiguity, always avoiding direct names, always implying that a quiet surrender was the intelligent move. Sarah didn't respond. She archived them, then traced the IP origin through a private security contact. It had been routed through a proxy, but the initial signal bounced from a shared office space frequently used by real estate consultants in the city's West End. It wasn't proof. But it was enough. Then came the third escalation. Public complaint. A physical petition was circulated around the neighborhood. It wasn't official, and it wasn't legal, but it was visible. Deliberately so. Residents were asked to sign a community letter of concern addressed to the city council, urging the reevaluation of private structures that posed visual and physical disruption to shared environmental harmony. Sarah obtained a copy through a neighbor who hadn't signed but wanted her to know. The language was sanitized, corporate, soft-edged, exactly the kind that masked its true purpose: groupthink enforcement. Karen's name wasn't on it, but several signatures were from neighbors Sarah had seen at past meetings. People who had once nodded hello and now wouldn't make eye contact. The petition didn't accuse her of anything. It simply created the impression that something was wrong, something out of place, something undesired. Sarah brought the document to Mitchell, who immediately began drafting a legal response. This time, it was a formal pre-litigation notice. If the harassment continued, if her insurance appeal was not fairly reviewed, and if her property continued to be targeted through unofficial channels, she would pursue damages under civil harassment statutes and file for injunctive relief. But even as the paperwork moved forward, the ground under her feet felt looser. Sarah could sense it in the way contractors hesitated to work on her landscaping, in the silence that followed her at the local grocery store, in the vague stares of unfamiliar cars idling just past her driveway. It was no longer just a legal battle. It was a psychological one. Then came the final act of pressure, covert but undeniable. Someone entered her property. There was no break-in, no signs of damage. But one morning, Sarah found her pool cover half unlatched, its anchoring strap detached and lying beside a wet footprint. The cameras hadn't caught it, deliberately avoided or perhaps blocked, but the presence was clear. Someone had tried to stage something, or worse, someone had been testing how close they could get. Sarah reported it to the police. They took the complaint but offered little beyond a report number and an empty reassurance. If there's no damage, it's not criminal trespass. But Sarah wasn't waiting for damage. She was preparing for it. She reinforced her perimeter. She installed a third layer of surveillance, hidden with multiple backups. She hired private patrol to drive by 3 times a night. Just presence, just visibility. She documented everything. She also filed a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Board, naming the firms linked to the mortgage inquiry and attaching the anonymous messages. Mitchell expanded the legal response to include potential coercion and property interference. The pressure was mounting. But it wasn't one-sided anymore. It was in this new equilibrium, threat and countermeasure, action and reply, that Sarah finally received word from the city. The audit on her property was being paused indefinitely, pending investigation into irregularities in the complaint process. It was vague, but the implication was clear. Someone higher up had noticed the inconsistencies. The chain of events wasn't clean. The volume of anonymous reports had raised suspicion, not just against Sarah, but against the very people who had tried to drown her in red tape. Oh. The next day, Karen was noticeably absent from her porch. Her car remained in the driveway, but her usual afternoon walk never occurred. For the first time in weeks, Sarah saw neighbors talking to each other without glancing toward her property. Something had shifted. The silence was no longer about exclusion. It was about discomfort, about guilt. No one apologized. No one approached her. But when Sarah walked her trash bin to the curb, a man from down the street nodded and said, "Rough couple of weeks, huh?" She nodded back. It was small, insignificant, but it was the first gesture of re-entry. Sarah didn't claim victory. There was no press release, no official statement of exoneration. There never would be. Her pool remained closed. Her insurance remained under review. Her legal filings were still in process. But something deeper had broken. The momentum of coordinated pressure, the quiet collaboration of a neighborhood led by fear and manipulation. Karen hadn't been exposed, at least not publicly, but she'd been revealed, if only through implication. And the people around her were no longer sure whose side they were supposed to be on. Sarah stood on her back patio that evening, hands folded, watching the last light fade across the water. The pool cover was in place. The gate was locked. The cameras were live. And yet, for the first time, she allowed herself a breath without calculation. She wasn't done. The campaign wasn't over. But the tide had turned. And for a woman who understood the physics of water better than most, that meant everything. The weeks that followed unfolded with the precise slowness of bureaucracy in motion. No longer aimed at her, but now cautiously circling the people who had orchestrated the pressure campaign from the shadows. Sarah no longer had to guess at the origin of the scheme. The documents Mitchell began receiving through preliminary discovery confirmed what she had already deduced. There had been coordinated messaging between members of the residential committee and a private development consultant. Language coded in phrases like potential restructuring candidates, early easement cooperation, and non-compliant aesthetic, footprint. Her name was never mentioned directly, but her address appeared repeatedly in spreadsheets under columns labeled pending resolution, review in progress, and most damningly, targeted influence pathway. What had begun as a harassment, campaign disguised as community safety, had evolved into a strategic maneuver to devalue or vacate select properties that didn't conform to a proposed redevelopment agenda. Mitchell responded by initiating a pre-litigation arbitration request, demanding transparency of all internal committee correspondence over the past 6 months, and filing a formal complaint with the City Ethics Board. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about establishing a pattern, and the pattern was unmistakable. What they found wasn't a singular vendetta by a bitter neighbor. It was a layered, deliberate process, refined over time and tested on other homeowners who, unlike Sarah, had either left or folded quietly. She wasn't the first to resist, but she was the first to have the legal, financial, and emotional bandwidth to push back in kind. That made her dangerous. The tipping point came when Mitchell, through a forensic audit of communication metadata, uncovered a series of messages exchanged between Karen Mercer and the development firm's assistant consultant, containing embedded PDFs of site schematics, notes about structural barriers, and personal commentary that made clear Karen's role was more than incidental. She wasn't simply a complainer. She was a liaison, a facilitator, a resident operative feeding the development firm ground-level intel under the guise of community concern. When confronted with this evidence, Mitchell immediately compiled and submitted it as part of the ongoing civil action, while also alerting the city's Legal Affairs Department, which had the authority to investigate conflicts of interest within neighborhood organizations operating under municipal charters. Word spread quickly, not publicly, not in headlines or town halls, but through the whispered pathways of suburban politics, the kind carried on breeze-snatched conversations at dog parks and overheard in checkout lines. Karen stopped appearing in public. Her car remained in her driveway for days at a time, and her blinds, once always open to monitor the street like a sentry's post, now remained shut. There was no confrontation, no confession, just disappearance, an evaporation of presence that said everything without a single word. Meanwhile, the insurance commission ruled in Sarah's favor. Their review concluded that the suspension of coverage had been based on unverified, non-regulatory sources and reinstated her policy with retroactive effect. Her pool was once again protected, her legal standing intact. But Sarah didn't celebrate. She didn't reopen the pool. Instead, she chose to keep it covered, closed, not as a concession but as a statement. It had never been about the pool. It had been about sovereignty, about the right to exist without permission in a space built on quiet agreements and unspoken hierarchies. Shortly after the ruling, Sarah was contacted by a junior member of the residential committee, not one of the aggressors, but someone who had remained silent during the ordeal. He asked to meet privately, off record. When they met at a neutral location, he confessed to having watched the campaign against her unfold, powerless to stop it, unsure of what was truly happening until the document surfaced. He offered to support a motion to restructure the committee's leadership and dissolve its discretionary development authority, which had never been formalized under law but had functioned with the city's tacit approval. Sarah listened, asked questions, and gave no promises. She didn't want titles. She didn't want control, but she did want accountability, and she made clear that she would not forget how quickly silence became complicity. The culmination came not with a trial or verdict, but with a vote, quiet, unpublicized, but critical. The city, under pressure from the ethics board and legal affairs investigators, withdrew its support for the neighborhood committee's administrative extensions. The group lost its ability to issue advisory notices, initiate redevelopment surveys, or submit community-wide hazard complaints without direct municipal oversight. It wasn't a full dismantling. It was a neutering. And in the world of soft power, it was a public death. Karen's official involvement was never acknowledged in any city memo, but she resigned from the committee 2 days after the vote, citing personal reasons. Her property was listed for sale a week later. No open house, no flyers. Just a quiet, abrupt departure that felt more like retreat than relocation. Sarah didn't watch the moving truck arrive. She didn't need to. The conflict wasn't with Karen anymore. It was with the structure that had enabled her. A structure that now lay exposed, hollowed out, and collapsing under its own false authority. In the days that followed, Sarah began to feel space return to the air around her. Conversations with neighbors became easier, or at least less forced. Contractors responded to her calls again. The trash was picked up on time. Packages stopped arriving late or damaged. It was the kind of change that would be imperceptible to someone who hadn't endured the slow, subtle violence of institutional ostracism. But to her, every returned nod, every non-avoided glance was a recalibration. A sign that the system which had once tried to unmake her was now struggling to reconstitute itself without its old tools. So she resumed swimming, but not in the way she had before. No therapy circuits, no prescribed routines, just slow movements through cool water, alone, eyes open to the sky. She didn't need to prove anything. She didn't need to reclaim anything, because she had never lost it. She had simply defended it, without permission, without allies, without expectation. That was the true climax. Not victory, but clarity. Not punishment, but the irrevocable understanding that some people don't retreat because they're afraid. They stay because they know they belong, and no amount of pressure can unwrite that truth. And when Mitchell called to tell her that the committee had formally dissolved its redevelopment partnership with the private firm, she said only, "Let them find someone easier next time." There was no triumph in her voice, just steel, just equilibrium, the kind forged under weight, not lifted by applause. Weeks passed with an unusual kind of stillness, not the tense silence of surveillance or strategy, but the kind that settles after a series of tremors when the ground finally decides to stop shifting. The neighborhood, once subtly orchestrated against her, had grown quiet, not in fear or shame, but in exhaustion. There were no more letters, no petitions, no midnight movements beyond the hedgerow. It was as if the air itself had been cleared, flushed of suspicion, stripped of pretense, heavy with a kind of reluctant respect. Sarah didn't pretend that things had returned to normal. Normal was what came before people showed you who they were when they thought the rules were on their side. What existed now was different. Not peace, but understanding. Not warmth, but distance with boundaries. Karen's house sold fast, purchased through a private transaction without a yard sign or a public listing. The moving truck came on a Tuesday morning, nondescript and quiet. Sarah watched through her window for a few minutes, not out of satisfaction, but out of closure. There was no final showdown, no last words, just cardboard boxes and a woman who once threatened to dismantle her life reduced to a vanishing figure. No one waved, no one acknowledged the departure. It was like the street collectively agreed to erase her as an error, an aberration too costly to remember. Sarah didn't need Karen gone to feel safe, but her absence left behind a kind of negative space, a reminder that some conflicts don't end with answers, but with absence. The committee, now stripped of its discretionary powers and restructured under city supervision, staggered on in a diminished form. The new members were quieter, more procedural. Meetings became shorter. Topics focused on utility coordination and public maintenance rather than policy overreach or development proposals. Sarah declined and offered to join. She didn't want a seat at their table. She didn't need a title to assert her rights. She had learned through fire that sometimes the most powerful statement is presence, uncompromised, uninvited, unbending. Mitchell closed the last of the filings with a brief message. All outstanding complaints withdrawn. All threats neutralized. All documentation archived. She asked for nothing more. There were no lawsuits for damages, no pursuit of headlines or statements to the press. She had always understood the value of restraint. Real victory wasn't measured by what you destroy, but by what you defend, without turning into what you're fighting. And she had protected more than her property. She had preserved her agency in a place where collective pressure was meant to overwrite individuality. In time, the neighbors began to soften in their way. A nod here, a greeting there. Gwen brought another plant, this one with a card. The couple from 2 doors down offered a gesture, a shared contractor contact, a tool lent without conditions. Sarah received them without resentment, but without illusions. They hadn't come to her defense when it counted, but they also hadn't doubled down when the campaign began to unravel. In a world like this, silence was its own kind of neutrality, and neutrality could be forgiven, eventually. The pool remained covered for several more weeks, not from fear, but from principle. Sarah wanted time, not to recover, but to calibrate, to choose when her return to routine would mean something to her and not just to the narrative of resolution others might assign. When she finally uncovered it, she didn't announce it. She didn't invite guests or take pictures. She simply stepped into the water at dusk, alone, letting the slow movement pull the tension from her limbs, and the quiet hum of the filtration system remind her of all the details she had fought to preserve. details that once seemed mundane, but now felt profound in their permanence. She adjusted her schedule, took on a new consulting work, more remote and on her own terms. Her experience had reinforced something she had always known but rarely voiced. Systems could fail you even when you followed the rules, and protection never came from permission, but from preparation. Her documentation, her refusal to react emotionally, her reliance on expertise over impulse, these weren't just tactics. They were survival, not of the body, but of dignity. She never spoke to Karen again. There were moments when she imagined what might have been said, if either of them had bothered to seek closure. But she always dismissed them. Some people didn't deserve the finality of dialogue. Their departure was the most honest sentence they would ever utter. What remained was Sarah's property, still intact, still hers, still defined by her own design. She had chosen every angle of that pool, every material, every safety feature. Not because she wanted luxury, but because she believed in doing things right, even when no one was watching. And now, everyone had watched. And no one could deny that she had done it right. There was no applause, no formal vindication, just water reflecting a darkening sky and the echo of something earned the hard way. Autonomy, the right to remain, the refusal to shrink. For Sarah, that was enough. That was everything.